all of you here today. This is our first spring semester Annenberg colloquium, and we are delighted to have Professor Lance Bennett with us from the University of Washington. Lance received his PhD in political science from Yale University, and he has been, for the most part, at the University of Washington ever since, with a few interesting detours along the way. He is the Ruddick C. Lawrence Professor of Communication, as well as Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. He's the author of 6 books. I think for this audience would probably be most familiar with Democracy in the Marketplace of Ideas, and his most recent book, Mediated Politics. Lance served as chair of the Political Communications section of the American Political Science Association, and in 1998 he received the very prestigious Editorial Pool Award from the American Political Science Association. He also received an honorary PhD in the year 2000 from Uppsala University. So he's done a lot of things. He's also lectured widely in the U.S. and is the founder of and director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement, which focuses on involvement of people with social life, politics, and global affairs. The title of his talk today is The Semi-Independent Press, the Battle for Public Information in the U.S. from Iraq to Hurricane Katrina. Lance, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is a full house, and it's wonderful to see. And I hear there's some people who will be moving in and out, so that's fine and understood. What I want to talk about today, and I hope to end early enough so that we can talk together about it as well, is a fundamental flaw in our press system that has dramatic implications for our democracy. This is not intended as a criticism of all of our press system, just one feature of it. But every once in a while when you have a system that is, and I think of this as an ecological system in which news organizations are interacting in a market, also interacting with government, interacting with audiences who are sometimes consumers, sometimes citizens, that in complex ecologies, flaws may develop that don't threaten much of the system, but do threaten some of the system. And so that's what I want to talk about today. If we can identify a flaw in our media ecology that has an important democratic consequence, if we can recognize it, show that it's systematic, and I would like to convince you that it may be systematic, then we might be able to think about how to change it. And this flaw, I submit to you, and this is tricky, and you may disagree with me, but I want to leave this with an optimistic tone. This flaw, I think, can be corrected because it is not, in its origin, completely dependent on the market pressures that are ravaging the news industry these days. It is a professional normative flaw that I think journalists, if reflective enough, can correct. But it will change the relationship between journalism and power in the society, and for that reason it will be difficult to correct, because journalists need to make a fundamental choice about whether their power relationship is most strongly aligned with government or with the people. So that's the frame for all of this, and let me get down to the rest of it. So this is a piece of a book that I'm doing with my colleagues Steve Livingston and Regina Lawrence on the arc of the Bush presidency, taking different moments in this amazing historical period we've lived through in the last 4 years as natural experimental cases of different conditions that affect the way in which the press criticizes or does not challenge government about various important public policy issues. Let's do a quick over. This is U.S. Press System 101, so we'll go through very quickly. We know all these things, concentrated, probably the most concentrated ownership in the advanced industrial democracies, probably the weakest public media sector in the advanced industrial democracies, racked in recent decades by growing profit pressures. 20% isn't enough, as Ed Guthman and I were talking lunch. 25 is what we really need. And as not just as a result of these profit pressures, but I think also because of historical trends, there's been a decline in investigative reporting. Investigative reporting historically is in sync with social movement activities in society, and I think we've seen a decline, particularly of left movement formations, the sort that feed investigative journalism from the audience side. But the piece I want to talk about today that I think most defines the U.S. press system is its core set of journalism norms, which look in different terms to be balanced, objective, neutral reporting, which persists despite amazing attacks on the impossibility of these things. So what does this system produce? Well, it produces a lot of official viewpoints that drive storylines. It's amazingly homogeneous. I would submit that the U.S. press system, given its competitiveness and the independence of news organizations, produces the single most homogeneous set of results of any nation. And why is that? Because it is overwhelmingly, time and again, going back to government for stories, cued by government. Stories have trouble advancing without government institutional processes, court decisions, congressional hearings, and other flywheels of government that advance stories. And this is the flaw that I want to talk about today. The most important output for me, democratically, is the incapacity to sustain challenges to dubious government policies when democracy most needs it. That is, when opponents in government fail to publicly challenge those policies. The press does a wonderful job when there are opponents in government, whether they are leaks of anonymous source nature, or whether they are members of Congress like John McCain standing up and saying we don't do torture, and challenging the Bush administration effectively and convincingly to stop that policy. So when does the system become fully independent of government? It happens. So I'm going to present a whole spectrum of near complete dependence on government defining the news to near complete independence from government defining the news. We have all of those potentialities in this press system, so I want to cover all of those kinds of cases, although the time permitting means that I'm going to focus on the one that I think the most interesting of that spectrum. But when we hit a perfect storm, so to speak, for journalism, where the press actually goes into a no-spin zone for a few days and is out there ahead of government officials, and indeed government officials are playing catch-up and end up looking very bad in the process. So we saw those moments of what the press can do by way of challenging officials in their failure to deliver policies when the situation seems to call for it. So let me distill all of this wind-up here into a simple model of the press and democracy, which is one that I've been spinning for some time, but it's now coming out in this book form, which looks at a whole spectrum of press-government relations cases. What does it mean to have this core journalistic norm of objectivity, neutrality, balance, this package of related norms, if you will? Well, suddenly authority becomes a working definition for objectivity. Okay, and Gay Tuckman, in her Sociology of the Press, told us this years ago, so this is no news for those who believe in the constructed nature of news. How is it constructed? So political news is shaped first by authorities and then echoed by others in society. So you do end up getting a choir of voices in some stories as the range of debate in national institutions expands. You get social movement actors in some cases and lots of other interest groups. So what I say in terms of simplifying this is that the voices and viewpoints in news are indexed, that is referenced by journalists and news organizations. This is my level of analysis here is not at the individual journalistic level. It is at the news organization's position and ecology of political relationships. But voices in view, the range of them are indexed to the degree of conflict in government institutions and among policy circles. So what does this mean in really simple terms? And I promise you, you can sort of run this through time and again, and it kind of keeps working. I mean, there's no perfect model. I'm not saying this explains all the variance in press output, but it explains enough in those moments when I think democratic quality is at stake that we need to pay attention to it. So when we have situations with high conflict and government opposition in action, we see diverse news. I mean, journalism is actually tracking that, and you get what looks like a spectrum, maybe not the complete spectrum, but a reasonable representation of social and political viewpoints in the news. When there's low conflict, however, in power circles, you get fewer voices and ideas in the news. Even if there are credible sources out there, and this is the test of the challenge for this model, even when there are credible sources out there that could be brought in to challenge dominant government positions. And even if there is strong opposition in society. And the relationship between news stories and the construction of public opinion is an interesting sub-story here that I won't go into. But public opinion is moved interestingly in and out of news depending on what the consensus levels in Washington appear to be on a particular story. To make it appear, as I heard on NPR this morning, that the public is a driving force in some stories, as on the national NSA eavesdropping scandal that we are currently reading in the front pages. The public featured prominently in that story. Why? Because there's serious conflict within the Republican Party and between the parties in Washington. So the public now plays a more central role in that news story. It's constructed in a more central way. So the range of voices and ideas in the news varies with government conflict. We know the stories that have a broad spectrum of public voice in them: abortion, taxes, religion. These look like the kind of reporting that a thriving democracy would want to have. You may not be satisfied with everything that the LA Times says about these issues, but you hear relatively more voices and viewpoints in them than you do in, for example, the Iraq War debate that we have most recently experienced a couple of years back. That debate was thoroughly dominated by Bush administration claims of weapons of mass destruction, al-Qaeda connections to Saddam that a plurality of Americans still believe to be true. The hangover effect of that news reporting is continuing with us. The Democrats took a pass, okay? They just took a strategic pass on this story. And so they did not provide the engine to drive another point of view into the headlines. And if it's not in the headlines, it really doesn't matter. Journalists do their job by reporting dissenting views on page 24 in these cases, where they don't really make an impact on framing public opinion. They're in there for the record, and indeed journalists need to be able to report those things on page 24 to know that they at least did their job. But putting it on page 24 doesn't get the public framing going that dispels belief that al-Qaeda in Iraq was somehow connecting around 9/11. The result is that challenges from outside sources, and there were many, and timely ones, were not given strong emphasis in the news, even though they were available to be reported. So what did we get? The war as Hollywood story. Iraqi people waiting their liberation with flowers and ready to spring forth with democracy. And really, this is not a bad rendition of that plot.
Who did that?
I don't know. I stole it on the internet. It's one of those public property pieces that's out there for the taking. Okay, but here's what's interesting, and here's where the natural experiment in this research comes in. Okay, we look for natural experiments in which you can go out of the laboratory and into a natural setting, and you see conditions change radically so that you can test simple propositions about what conditions prevail in order for what kinds of news frames to dominate. So this sets up my natural experiment. Both the leading papers, the Times and the Post, issued really extraordinary moments of apology for their bad reporting. They blew it in the ways in which they would admit blowing it. They admitted blowing it. So the Post becomes the latest prestige U.S. newspaper to question its own coverage. This is an Agence France article, but here, let's go to the Post itself. Here's a piece. The Post did a lot of self-reporting after that embarrassing moment. The paper was not front-paging stuff. Things that challenged, and here's where I got the 824 reference, things that challenged the administration were on A18 on Sunday or A24 on Monday.
there was an ad, and this is key, is that there was an attitude among the editors, look, we're going to war, so why do we even worry about all this contrary stuff? The alignment with power has become so close between the elite American press and government that they are inside the minds of those in power rather than trying to question those minds for the benefit of their readers and their citizens. And this is a mindset that I think has developed ecologically that needs to be recognized and challenged. So Len Downey, whom we've interviewed for our book, and he says basically the same thing, although he elaborates a bit, is we were so focused on trying to figure out what the administration was doing that we didn't give the same play to people who said it wasn't a good idea to go to war and who were questioning the administration's rationale. We were so focused on what the administration was doing. And then he says, the voices raising questions were lonely ones. We didn't pay attention to the minority. Well, how do we know they were a minority? How do we know that they were lonely? Why were they lonely? Because they were constructed out of the news. So they were lonely in news terms, not necessarily lonely in political, social terms. Lonely in the news. And they were indeed lonely voices in the news. They almost never got in. So the New York Times looks back. Here's the masthead editorial. Stunning moment. I read this one morning as I was waking up with my coffee, and indeed, I smelled the coffee. Over the last year, this newspaper has shown the bright light of hindsight on decisions. It's past time we turned the same light on ourselves. We found a number of instances of coverage that was not as rigorous as it should have been. And we know who they're talking about there. Looking back, we wish we had been more aggressive re-examining the claims as evidence emerged. Okay, so there's this moment of self-reflectiveness, which I think is very important. What did they do next? So my question to my researchers is, there's going to be another case coming along. This war ain't over yet. There's more big stuff coming up. When the next big catastrophic event occurs, we need to be all over it. And we need to see if the reporting is any different than the model would predict, given this timely moment of self-reflection. So the indexing model predicts that no matter how much self-reflection goes on about these things, the ecological relationship between news organizations and government is so fixed and established that when the same conditions prevail, the same kinds of reporting will take place again and again and again, unless we understand it and try to change the relationship in the ecology between news organizations and those in power. So the next case in our natural experiment was the treatment of prisoners in Iraq. Okay? There was strong evidence that the Bush administration had developed an informal policy of torture. Nobody signed off on it because you don't sign off on breaking the law. It was euphemistically referred to as torture light by Joe Lelyveld in an interesting New York Times Magazine article. And that's, I think, how the administration thought of it, too, as torture light. But torture by any name, light or otherwise, is a violation of international and national laws. And an important part of the story, which might have come out had that story been framed around torture, is that it was inflicted on innocent people who were picked up in street sweeps. I mean, it wasn't, whether or not you believe in torture, you would want it to be applied correctly, wouldn't you? And it created an international image disaster of vast and unknown proportions inside the U.S., because the U.S. press also operates as a shield against international opinion, because it's filtering it through Washington. So what Washington is responding to gets reported, and what isn't has trouble fitting inside the news frames. So here's my question. With all those photos, and to the credit of the Washington Post, those photos enabled the Post to continue a story. So there was a flywheel there that the Post had some control over that wasn't entirely dependent on government. The Post was able to continue the story by releasing photos that appeared to contribute new information to the story. But the bottom line question is, how was the story framed at the end of that summer leading into the elections of 2004? A, was it framed based on administration claims that Abu Ghraib was an unfortunate case of low-level abuse at the bottom of the chain of command? Or B, was it framed on evidence that existed at the time that torture was being practiced with a legal rationale developed at the top and passed down in informal ways through that chain of command, with the unfortunate results that we saw in those horrifying photos. And I am not arguing here that the news should decide which of these frames, but if there is some reason to talk about both of them, shouldn't both of them be balanced in the news? If we have a norm of balance and there are sources and evidence for the second frame, shouldn't that be at least somewhat competitive with the first frame, which is of course being offered up day in and day out and repeated by every key administration source that has the ear of a journalist? Okay, which frame was dominant? Well, the key conditions that we looked at are, in this election year, once again, our friends the Democrats took a pass. That seems to be what their key political strategy is these days. The Republicans closed ranks around McCain's objections for the election, right? This was not, neither party wanted this to be an election issue. It was a losing issue for the Democrats and an embarrassing one for the Republicans. So McCain, being the good soldier that he is, waited until after the election to create the certain misery that he's created for W around this one. So the prediction under those conditions from our model is that the press reports would emphasize abuse and minimize the evidence of torture, even though it was available for reporting. Much of it came out of the administration's own archives and documents. So our test of this was a content analysis of the framing of this story on Abu Ghraib in the Washington Post, which led the story after CBS broke it at the end of April. And the Post ran 600 or so pieces over the summer, so it was a really substantial story for the Post. The Post had the biggest cache of photos. We then took 10 national newspapers just to make sure that our selection of the Post was not out of line with what the rest of the press was echoing from the lead paper in this case, and CBS News, which actually broke the story and did report it more intensively than it might otherwise have because of breaking the story. So here's the Post. I'm not going to show you all the data because time is short and questions are more fun. But here's the primary news frames, and if you want to talk about methods, I'm happy to talk about methods. They gave us enormous pain for several months working out all of this. It looks simple here, but it killed us for several months until we got the reliability and the coding scheme down the way we felt it should be. So this is the news frames in the Post, and we broke out news and editorials. We threw out letters to the editor because I don't know what their selection mechanism is for those, or how important letters to the editor are in the framing of public opinion and national debates. So we just looked at news and editorials, both masthead and op-eds on the editorial page. And as you see, torture occupied a minuscule 3% of the lead frames in news items, and in 17% of the editorials. There's another story here that I want to develop after this book is written, which is what kind of conversation do editorial masthead writers think they're having with those in power? Because they can take the same evidence that was not reported in their news pages and cite it in an editorial and actually call it torture. So suddenly torture becomes a more used term, although again not dramatically more so, but interestingly more used. We then decided to relax our standards. Maybe we're being too tough. So we decided to code the articles for the first or the second frame that appeared. So in case the narrative had developed around a sort of a lightish entry into the topic with torture then being introduced later, because it is a very sensitive and important term to anchor, I think, in a story like this. But it turns out that even by our most generous measure, torture appeared as a first or second frame in only 11% of the articles over that summer of 2004. So here's something that I think is even more interesting about the data. This is the time series from the week the story broke through the end of summer, when it was put to bed by congressional hearings and the Schlesinger report in order to make the election safe from this concept and this discussion. That's my personal analysis. I don't have proof of that one. But what I do have is that in the early days, almost all of the mentions of the term torture appeared. Okay? That's when journalists had the photos and were out there a bit ahead of government because the hearings and the press events did not begin cascading until after the first week. So you get the actual, the peak in almost all of the references to torture in the early days before news management and institutional framing began to take their hold on the press. And I asked a couple of journalists at a conference I was at in the spring about that, and both told me the same thing. I asked Dana Priest of the Post, what's with this? You guys did actually call it torture in the early days, and then it stopped. And her answer was fascinating to me. She said, well, we tried to get somebody inside government to resonate with that and to keep the story going. And I said, is that how it's supposed to work? that you float a trial balloon, and if nobody on government grabs onto it, then you drop the story? She said, well, it's hard to keep the story going. I asked Phil Taubman the same question, because the Times pattern is exactly the same. He said, without the flywheel of a government process, how do you expect us to continue the story? I can only shrug. But that is very revealing. I mean, it tells me that we are into a systematic process here. This is systematic, and that is why after that moment of reflection, you get this pattern the next time out. So here's our national paper sample. I won't belabor it. What I will say, this is news and editorial from this sample of national papers, which is, as you can see, pretty all over the place. And this is news and editorials, and this bottom line here is items that framed those events as torture. Okay? It's the even more dramatic is this is the national press. Okay? There is almost no bottom line here when it comes to news only. These are news stories only in that sample, same sample of papers. Almost no torture only. And if you look at torture plus other, it's the smallest line in the graph. We've done an international news sample by comparison, and as you might imagine, it's quite different. It's quite different. These lines are flipped. In the only paper, actually, that looked anything like the Washington Post or a national paper sample was Rupert Murdoch's Times of London. Okay, so what happened here, and why does this matter? Why does this matter in terms of public misinformation and public perceptions of its government? As you see, the photos had quite an impact. The war, you know, there was some erosion of support, to be sure, but the public support for the war was kind of bumping along at a nice 60% clip here. Seemed to have fairly much stabilized. The photos hit, and look at that drop. Look at what happened just because of those photos. So the photos alone had a kind of a stunning impact on public opinion, but the damage control operation that got the press caught up in its grip ended up, along with a couple of other things, there was the Bush victory and there was a moment of resurgence of support for Bush. But look at this, by the election time, we had an almost complete restoration of pretty strong support for sending in the troops after that. Comparing this to other wars, I think, is interesting. The only resurgence of opinion I could find in other comparable wars, I don't know what's a comparable war exactly, but is this one in Korea. But what caused that was the entry of China into the war, a kind of an independent sort of event. The resurgence in Iraq was, I think, pretty much due to spin and the involvement of the press in that special relationship to government that I'm talking about. Now, torture has become a household word. I mean, it's, you know, we're talking about different moments in this ecological relationship, which is conditioned by different factors. So one moment in which torture came into play was the White House memos. Remember Alberto Gonzalez, our Attorney General, back then when he was writing memos about torture? And he put his name to these kinds of bending of the meanings of this important term, saying that the terrorism had made the Geneva Conventions obsolete. These could be headline stories. I mean, these could have been headline stories. In my book, they might well have been, because these are kind of major government policy shifts. But the White House spun that away. The memos were just ideas. They weren't put into practice. We were just playing. I don't know. They were sitting around with nothing better to do, so they drew up a torture policy that they then threw out, apparently. Later investigations linked these memos, and the press had that information in a timely way, to interrogation practices in Cuba and Iraq. I mean, all the pieces were there. The memos, the patterns in Afghanistan, in Cuba, in Iraq, all the pieces were there, but nobody in government would authorize calling them torture. That's all that was missing for the press to be able to say that. That's all that was missing. So in the Senate confirmation hearings for Attorney General, there was kind of a Greek chorus of senators on both sides saying, "Say it ain't so, Alberto. Say you don't believe in torture." And they all stood up and said, "Torture is a very bad thing. The Republicans did, the Democrats did. Alberto, do you believe in torture?" Alberto said, "Of course not. Who could think such a thing?" Both Republicans and Democrats invited Gonzalez to say he didn't support torture, and guess what? He did say he didn't support torture. But here's what's interesting. When I go and deconstruct the news coverage, torture appeared in those news stories tightly bounded to Alberto Gonzalez and the question of the memos. When journalists then told us why those memos mattered, because good journalists actually do put things in context and tell us why things matter, they referred us back to Abu Ghraib and used the term abuse. Every time. I mean, 99% of the time. When the real-world situation to which these memos might be applicable was described, the term abuse came back in. So we have a narrative vocabulary which was reinforced by all of these repeated relations over that summer of 2004, and it's still in play today. If you listen carefully to the news, you'll hear torture a lot in this day attached to the McCain Amendment that Bush was forced to accept. But when journalists talk about the real-world situations, the tendency is still to use the word abuse and not torture. So torture apparently doesn't exist in the real world, is my only conclusion from reading the press. It exists in documents and in legislation. So the most recent iteration of the term was the McCain split in the Republican Party. And we got the word torture right there in the headlines. This would have been coded as a torture frame in our coding scheme, and there it is right there in the second line. Why? Because the staffers for John McCain were talking about torture to the reporters, and so it was okay to use the word. So torture finally becomes a sanctioned news frame. So we did a quick search. This is all the data from here on out, and I think this is all the data you're going to see from here on out. This is still in the processing stage, so I'm not as confident that this is going to hold as the other stuff, which we have looked at 20 times. But a quick search just before I came down here of the Post showed more than 50 items on the McCain Amendment, and 77% used torture because it was officially okay to do it. And only 55% used abuse or mistreatment, interestingly enough, and most of those were in references to why all of this stuff was being discussed, because there were things happening out in the real world with rendition and secret prisons and so on, where abuse was going on. The effects of the frame shift, and this is what's important for democracy, is that Bush was held publicly accountable for an important government policy. And isn't that what we want the press to do? Isn't that really what we hope the press is going to do, as opposed to being a publicity channel for government? And I know that's a strong and harsh statement. But if we think about two models of the press as government publicity channel, press as government accountability mechanism, most democratic theorists would lean in the direction of accountability mechanism. I'm just guessing. I haven't surveyed all the democratic theorists yet, but so holding the administration accountable in a timely fashion for going to war, for abusing or torturing possibly innocent civilians in the country we are at war in. So, and this brings me to Katrina, which I don't have enough time to go into a full-blown analysis of, so to speak, but you all have been there and seen that, right? So I don't think I really need to. There are some wrinkles here. TV was more independent than print, and we're gathering evidence on that, and there's some reasons, I think, why. But for nearly a week, we watched this scene unravel before our very eyes. key government officials, Michael Brown, Chertoff, I mean, they didn't know what was happening. Ted Koppel interviews them, and they kind of are getting their information from him during the interview. So the press had entered a no-spin zone far ahead of the press managers. Most of the administration was on vacation. Karl Rove was passing a kidney stone. And Bush is out there on his own for once. And what is his first grand pronouncement? Heck of a job, Brownie. So all of these things increased the independence of the press. But as I said, it took a perfect storm of conditions. So independent news coverage, holding government officials accountable, is possible. So there are conditions under which that occurs. And this is one of them. Not the only one, but this is one of them. So let me conclude and then take questions. So the first conclusion that I draw from this study is that the leading U.S. news organizations cannot sustain critical reporting. There may be moments of investigative reporting. In fact, Ed reminds me that there are more than we probably recognize, in part because they occur at local levels often. But the sustainability of those stories, even when the Post had evidence of torture, it couldn't sustain it for more than a week. Okay? For more than a week before the government news management completely reframed the story. So this can't be done without support from inside government. So the UN was not a good enough source on weapons of mass destruction, even though, in the end, it turns out they were right. They were right. But they weren't a good enough source. And our interview with Len Downey suggests that he, when we asked him why he couldn't use torture, because it was a policy, it was an editorial policy. It wasn't just journalists deciding, it was Len Downey and the editors helping journalists decide what to call these things. I said, well, why, given all this evidence, there was Red Cross reports, there were human rights reports, the photos, the memos, fair amount of evidence. Why couldn't you call it torture? We didn't have enough evidence. I think what he meant is he didn't have enough evidence that was sanctioned by the right sources to report. And we're probing him on that. We're going to interview him one more time. Second conclusion that I come to is that if government sources for critical stories do not exist, the government is kind of left to police itself, which I believe is what we're witnessing politically today in Washington. A government that has been left to police itself and isn't doing a really great job. As you would expect, right? What's the point of the press? Back to my question. What's the point of the press? Well, I think we can see it in Washington today. And even with inside sources, the best example of reporting out there today is the New York Times eavesdropping story, and they waited a year at the request of the government. Tell me, what is that about? I mean, I think I have some ideas about what it's about, but the extraordinary thing is, with all they had on that story, with the massive importance of that story, they waited a year. And if you read this morning's New York Times story, they've been running pretty much a story or two a day on that. They are now reframing it as a press management story, basically saying Karl Rove is going to come out and turn this around into a positive and kill the Democrats with it in this election. And the Times question is, can the Democrats figure out a way to counter it, sotto voce, that we can report and keep the story going? So it is now being closed back into a Washington story by the Times itself, even as they break it. So my final point here is that when the democracy needs most an independent, critical public voice, the American press often can't provide it. Even though, and I want to make this entirely clear, it does a terrific job when the government is working well. So I can't fault the press when government works well. It's just when it's not that I think we have a flaw in our system. And that's what I would like to see us think about trying to fix. Thanks very much.
Two things that occurred to me. One was that even some of the dissenting stories, like the Seymour Hersh stories in the New Yorker, are quite clearly inspired by there's somebody who doesn't like what the Pentagon's doing.
Right.
It's almost certainly the CIA. So, even some of the dissenting stories are because an agency within government is providing.
Oh, absolutely,
story.
absolutely. Yeah, what's interesting is that Seymour Hersh got those sources, and yet his reporting remains in the second circle of power, right? And I think we could actually begin to define pretty clear concentric circles of the press around power in this ecology of media. And Hersh is interesting because he's clearly in the second circle, which means it's hard for him to get stories into the first circle. Very hard, even though he tries to maintain, we're interviewing him too, and he tries to maintain very good relations with his colleagues in the first circle of power. But his sources were inside government, very clearly. He, of course, had to promise them confidentiality, just as Judith Miller promised hers confidentiality. But interestingly enough, before the Miller scandal became all that clear, it was okay for the Times to practice confidentiality, but Hersh is held suspect for practicing confidentiality. So I think that there's some very interesting dynamics going on with people like Hersh.
My question was, when do you think this system evolved? Has there always been a tendency for the American press to work this way?
Yeah, and that's actually the happy ending. Although it doesn't sound like it when you put it that way. But here's what's a happy ending. Is that this, I think, can be traced back to a convergence of factors in the 19-teens and 20s. The kind of the death of muckraking at the hands of elites, like Teddy Roosevelt, who gave it that unpleasant name. And then the further decline of critical journalism around an economic depression that killed subscriptions to McClure's magazines and things like that, and the decline of social movements in the 1920s that had fed critical journalism. And then the rise of the progressive movement, which was attached to the creation of a professional press that adopted objectivity as one of its norms, which converged in this ecology very nicely with the commercial interests of creating a product that could be distributed and sold as widely as possible without a market-narrowing political tint applied to it. And then that was embellished by the war. And indeed, the history of both world wars was one of close press cooperation with government, which I think had a residue. I think it had a carryover to date. And now it's simply become routine and reinforced today by the thrill of being on the inside.
So Vietnam becomes like a sort of an anomaly. And
not at all. Vietnam is perfectly explainable by this theory.
Sure.
Absolutely fits the case. Vietnam was the conforming press pattern up until the point that government officials in the military, in the Defense Department, began to tell reporters, and troops in the field, officers in the field, began to tell reporters that the press was not embedded in the same way in Vietnam. That's a difference in the story. Tell reporters that the war was going badly and that it was probably a mistake. And that doesn't mean that the press flipped the other way. It just means that another point of view entered the story, which is kind of what we would like a balanced report to be. So,
absolutely. Great, thank you.
Peter.
That's a fascinating description, though pretty scary. I'm wondering about the explanation. And I thought you were going into possibilities to explain that by looking at the difference to the Katrina example. The explanation I heard is that you said with Katrina it took and it had a perfect storm. And that's what it takes to undo that. But the Iraq War was a perfect storm. So I don't see why it happened with Katrina and it didn't work out with the Iraq War.
Oh, but the Iraq War was not a perfect storm the Iraq War has been a gradual erosion of public opinion, but the press has not really taken strong positions on framing the Iraq War, even at this point, in terms of policy failure. There have been criticisms of this and that, and the failure to protect the weapon sites and to have a backup plan for the oil and all of that stuff. But I think that the Iraq War was actually framed continuously, and it still is. I would predict, and anyone out there interested in gathering some data could help me test it, that even today the administration is the strongest voice in framing the Iraq War. Now there's enough daily bombings and mayhem and indications of failure just evident to the American people that go right through the news because the visuals are catastrophic, just as those photos alone, before they'd been framed by anybody, plummeted opinion 10 points.
But that's not completely different to Katrina. And why did the press have the guts to cover that differently?
Because it's up.
Somebody's got an answer for this question.
Because it's here.
I think that it's here, that the juxtaposition between government, just lack of comprehension of what was going on and what was going on was so gross that, and TV was on the air all the time with this. You know, Anderson Cooper was right there on the scene all the time. And what was he going to do? You know, but look at human suffering and then ask, who's doing anything about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say if we'd have had government or relief-embedded reporters only in Katrina, we might have not had the full coverage. My question is do you see new technologies, whether they be new technologies of productions for traditional media or non-traditional reporting, either one, do you see those as potentially disrupting the ecology or having significant effects? Blogosphere is one example, but it seems to me mass media is transforming itself to adapt to interactive.
That's a wonderful question, absolutely wonderful question. Let me give you two quick takes on it because it's such a rich question that I don't want to go on too long with it. But one competitive theory about journalism in general is that because journalists now have new technologies that enable them to go to a remote site and put the news back to us instantly ahead of government, that this is kind of creating an event-driven dynamic in news that is making for more independent coverage and assessment and framing of situations. And so Steve Livingston and I did a study looking at 10 years of CNN international desk stories that were event-driven, that we kicked out press conferences and Washington-based stories and looked at event-driven news. And what we found was interesting is that sort of like the torture stories, when the photos were released, the first few days there were some frames, some independent journalistic frames introduced in the news. What we found, though, is that very quickly, if it's a big event, that officials begin to manage the news, and officials are dropped in routinely pretty early on to take over the framing of stories. But the bigger part of your question about technology and the reinvention of news, I think, is that my guess is that because this is an ecological process that no player is probably aware of in a deep, reflective way. It's a very complex system. But one thing that news organizations are aware of is their own imminent death at the hands of their audiences or their fleeing audiences. And so the news business is in a state of near crisis. I mean, I think it would be too much to call it crisis, but impending difficulties, let's say. And there should be, I think, more than there is, because some of these organizations are too big to be very flexible. I mean, the concentration problem may be the end of innovation in a way, because they have always been doing it the way they've always been doing it, and they're trying to economize on the old model, right? And sometimes innovation requires money and resources and experimentation. But here's some glimmers of hope that I think will shake this ecology and that will begin to help journalists and news organizations think about a different relationship to their audiences, which might end up being good for democracy. One model I see is the creation of quite independent information channels outside of that first sphere of media. Independent media channels of the sort we know about, indie media and others. Move On. There are conservative versions of these things where people are getting news in a different package, a package that suits an emerging change in citizenship styles. Whereas people want news they can use. I mean, we've heard that from the marketers in journalism, but we're also hearing it from citizens. Is don't give me a one-dimensional piece of news that I'm not included in. Put me in the news. Well, of course, if your news is all filtered through Washington elites, most citizens are not put in the news. So people are finding news reports that actually take their own feedback. MoveOn has developed a nice model here of figuring out who's responding to what, of sending them information that's packaged along with an action menu that enables them to make a quick decision about doing something as a citizen and moving on, because we're all busy. So that's one model that I think can be expanded into a news of the future view. The second model, which I see, is not unlike that, and that's the one that the BBC is using to reinvent itself. It turns out that BBC has a little bit more freedom to reinvent itself. In some ways not, because their government is all over them these days. But the BBC is beginning to think about a model of actually facilitating citizen networking around important topics, around important political topics, and using their and thinking of themselves not just as news providers, but as information service to citizen networks and facilitating citizen actions in relation to government. Now, as you can imagine, the British government may not be entirely happy with this development, because governments tend to think of publics as things to be managed. And if publics begin to be organized by information services, like the BBC, that may create a different dynamic in the ecology of publics and their government. I mean, I think it would be a useful dynamic, personally, but it would be different, and change is something that politicians don't like because they've just figured out how to play the game they're playing. So I see the BBC model. If you want to look at it, it's I can. They're still tuning it and retuning it, but I like that model.
Actually, I was going to ask Jeanette that another point is, a lot of this, I mean, you were talking about the beginning of the early 20th century, seems always to be cyclical.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there are two sort of somewhat different inflections in sort of recent cycles. Mm-hmm. One is, I mean, there's the post-Vietnam one, which I think got hopefully well past now, Vietnam syndrome. Mm-hmm. But the other is post-Watergate, which I think, for at least this generation, or at least part of one of these generations, became a reference point for journalism versus government. Mm-hmm. I think it's faded a lot. But another factor, I don't know whether you think this played in, was, and it's part of the post-Watergate attack by government, was the undoing of the fairness doctrine. Indeed, indeed. Which I think shifted the media landscape in a way that I'm not sure I didn't exactly anticipate, and it wasn't exactly what they went after, and helped launch the talk radio phenomenon of the one-sided, endlessly repeated part, which then I think is played on. I mean, I think your sort of Karl Rovian puppet master can use that, because it seems to me that the factor that runs through this is intimidation. And I guess one other factor would be the consolidation of corporate media rather than family media. Sure. I mean, the family corporation had backbone in some occasions, at least in a way that the corporate one never does.
Yeah. I think those are excellent points, and indeed they inspire me to try to sketch out this ecology more fully and see what the key tension points are. Because I believe you're quite right that even though we have a very commercially heavy system, extremely so, that was mitigated by government regulation. And the Fairness Doctrine is an excellent example. There's a nice piece in this week's New Yorker, I think, by Nicholas Lehman that's actually on Edward R. Murrow, but it goes back to Murrow's involvement in the creation of the Fairness Doctrine and how that evolved and what happened when it ended. So I recommend that to you because it's a very important point.
I have two questions, comments. One is about the distinction you have made between abuse and torture. You know, torture, Americans romanticize torture. They think about Middle Ages, torture chambers where people are cut into pieces. So it depends how you define the line between torture and abuse. Some people may argue that you have torture in your prisons every day, not just in Abu Ghraib, but every day.
Sure.
So, and I would say that perhaps you have been too harsh on the media because at the beginning you can use this word, but then it might be more complicated objectively because you have to define what torture is Maybe abuse is an extreme. Extreme abuse could be then defined as torture. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
I think that's an excellent point, and I believe that set of worries is precisely what led editors like Len Downey to steer away from it. Okay, but here's my response to that question, which is that if a number of human rights legal experts were calling it torture, and if that term has a legal standing that has serious implications for U.S. policy, for the legality of U.S. policy, for the image of America in the world, it's not for journalists to define, right? It's simply for journalists to open that definitional debate. So I think that the role of the press is not to tell us what things are, although they do quite often end up telling us what things are for the reasons that I'm talking about here. But the role is not to tell us what something is, but to invite us to have a public discussion about what it might be, and without introducing that alternative, all the questions that you raise were not asked or discussed in the news. So I think that you're on the right track, but that the introduction of another frame in this story would have enabled that definitional exercise so that we might all have felt that we knew what was going on more clearly.
Okay, then I want to
Sure, we just talked for quite a while longer. And
Thanks, this has been really fun.
really been nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.